The situation I'm in at the moment is designing the UI of a photography game I've been working on. The question I'm facing is, how do you make a good UI that clearly explains the gameplay visually? What does it feel like to play? This is a twofold reason. As a game, you want players to easily be able to pick up and understand the gameplay. And for marketing reasons, someone should be able to look at a screenshot of your game and instantly know what it's about, within about 10 seconds of looking at the UI. The temptation for UI would be to impersonate a political cartoonist and label everything, or reach a level of Zen minimalism that would look like the last 6 months of activity on this channel. I think there's a third way. I'm going to use the example of Sekiro for this, but this could be applied to any other manner of games. Let's hold on to Sekiro for a moment and apply a vice minimalist effect for seemingly no reason. Before we can talk about Sekiro, I'm going to talk about an academic concept and introduce you to the wild world of semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs and their relationship with objects and meaning. One of the first semiotician,
you dumb fuck,
Ferdinand Saussure, said that there were two elements of a sign, the signifier and the signified. The signifier is the sound or image that represents something. The signified is what idea is being conveyed. Put both of these together and you have a sign. For example, the image of a skull crossbones. This could signify extreme danger is in the area, as in, don't stick your fingers in here, you'll die. The image conveyed could also be text. For example, the word danger would signify that there's danger present. Saussure's stuff seems pretty self-explanatory, right? But it also has its limitations. He supposed that the creation of a sign had to be abstract, intentionally made by a human. Inanimate or natural objects were discounted under Saussure. Next came Charles Sanders Peirce with a total flip of the idea of semiotic theory. For Peirce, a sign, or as he called it, a representamen, is something that stands for something else. Peirce explained that signs consisted of three elements: an object, a sign, and an interpretant. This is where things start to get a little bit more complex. Perhaps the easiest way to do this is to draw it out. In our scenario, there is a swamp. In the swamp, there's a poisonous gas which will make people sick if they breathe it in. To stop people from walking in, the government installs a sign. This sign says, "There is poisonous gas here. If you breathe it in, you'll get sick." The person walks up to the swamp, sees the sign, and they immediately think, "Whoa, there's poisonous gas in here. I don't want to get sick." The way Peirce explains this relationship is like this. The object in this case, the poisonous gas, is the thing which the sign references. So the sign is in reference to this. The next part is the interpretant. That is, not the person, but what the person is thinking once they read the sign. Now right now you're probably saying to yourself, yeah, no duh this. The thing is though, Peircean semiotics gets interesting because it expands the idea of a sign as it classifies how these signs are portrayed. For Peirce, there are three types of sign: an icon, an index, and a symbol. An icon is something that directly references the object. Perhaps this is what an object does or what it looks like. So for example, a sign would go from reading "there's poisonous gas in here" to an icon of swampy bubbles or an icon that represents the sickness. Our friend here looks at the sign and goes, "Whoa, there's poisonous gas in here. I don't want to get sick." A symbol is something that takes on a more abstract form. For example, let's say that the poisonous swamps were very common in this area. So the government made a sign that was an orange triangle. This symbol has nothing to do with the concept of poison or the swamp. Now our friend here, as someone who got his swamp exploring license, he understands the acquired cultural context of this sign and he says, "Whoa, there's poisonous gas in here. I don't want to get sick." An index is perhaps the trickiest of Peircean theory. Let's say our friend here didn't pass any signs when entering the swamp. But when he came in, he saw a bunch of dead animals, as well as a mythical glowing mushroom that only blooms when the concentration of the poisonous gas is present. Our friend here is a pretty switched on person, and they look at this and they say to themselves, "Whoa, there's poisonous gas in here. I don't want to get sick." Unlike Saussure, Peircean semiotics said that animals in nature are actually able to create signs. So you get it, right? Well, before we move on to Sekiro, there's one more theory of semiotics I want to talk about. It comes from one of my favourite authors, the evil and terrible postmodernist Umberto Eco. The problem Eco ran into here was that Saussure was quite rigid, as he viewed the idea of signs being a process that only the intelligence of humans could produce. The Enlightenment and all that kind of thing. From there, we got Peirce, who included nature in this equation as something that could produce signs. What Eco proposed was,
bruh, what if anything that could substitute for something else could also be considered a sign? What if people were signs too?
But he was actually 100% right in this observation. Look at Marlboro Marine, for example. It's a person, but it's also a sign of things like American concepts of masculinity and the duality of man, and you get the point. So back to our seemingly inconspicuous image of Sekiro here, and just to remind you, this was actually a video about Sekiro. So sir, sign and signified. Pierce, object, sign, interpretant. Echo, people can be assigned too. And this is where our ongoing discussion of video games starts today. So my intention with explaining how semiotics works is to give you a foundation of some of the examples of how the UI in Sekiro works, so you can identify how other games do this. For the fellow devs watching this video, I'm not going to be prescriptive here. This video should hopefully give you something to think about though. To begin with, I'm going to make a radical statement here. The UI is not just the 2D canvas on top of the game. So to explain what I mean by this, I want to explain these two aspects of UI, which I call the abstract UI and the organic UI. The abstract UI is something almost everyone is familiar with by now. Gigantic prompts for an input, graphic or color. It's the very intentional abstract graphics that go above the game. Thankfully, Sekiro exercises a lot of restraint here. As a personal preference, I'm not a big fan of using graphics which represent keys or controller inputs for two reasons. It, one, reminds me I'm playing a video game, and two, and this is quite minor, it locates the game's language of play to a system. Someone playing on Xbox versus PlayStation now has a slightly different dialect for how they look at the game. That is, on Xbox, I know to press X when the X button appears, and on PlayStation, I know to press square when the square button appears. If, however, I used a graphic which gave me an acquired cultural context of what it means, I wouldn't need to know that X means X. I would know that, in the case of Sekiro, green means grapple. In Sekiro, to grapple to a position, the game shows the sign of a green circle. This circle is so instantly consumable, I'm able to know almost immediately if I'm able to grapple. Think for a second about this design, because this is so visually distinct and easy to read, I'm rapidly able to interpret the sign the game presents. So, object, grapple point, sign, a green circle, and interpretant, that is, what goes through the player's head, press R2 to grapple. However, this green circle has a family member in Sekiro, the green triangle. In Sekiro, certain enemies will occasionally have the green triangle appear above them, but I, like many players, first encountered this by accident. I saw the green and immediately pressed R2, as these grapple points have always represented safety. When pressing R2, however, I grappled forward, and after a while I realized that this symbol was a green triangle. So the green circle and green triangle were semiotic cousins in this case. They both produced the same interpretant when I originally encountered them, but after I went on to learn about them, my decision-making process expanded, and I was able to lock away more information. Perhaps the coup de grace of this idea is, no pun intended, the red circle which indicates a death blow. The death blow mechanic in Sekiro is perhaps the most important fight-changing element. One quick press of the R1 button and Sekiro is able to kill almost any enemy instantly, from a variety of scenarios. So like before, object, death blow, sign, red circle, interpretant, press R1 and you will win that fight. However, over the course of Sekiro, this sign presents itself in many new ways. Pressing R1 after a death blow can do a possession or blood cloud. Once the mortal blade is unlocked, the sign to death blow again flashes, and perhaps my favourite is the serpent. So our abstract UI is these 2D elements which appear on the screen to tell us what we can and can't do. But what is organic UI? Well, organic UI comes from what Echo proposed. People can be signs too. In the context of a video game, that means that the player character and enemy can be UI elements as well. Now, a lot can be said about Dead Space's UI, which is incorporated to the design of the suit and such, but this is not what I mean. To me, this is still an abstract UI, it's just really creatively implemented into the game. What I mean is that the things in the game can be UI elements that are signs for the player. One of my favourites is how sparks work. In Sekiro, blocking an attack will result in a spark effect from the swords clanging together, but a successful deflection will result in the yellow-coloured sparks exploding off the impact. This is an example of how an index becomes signified in a video game. The sparks are not the deflection themselves, but a byproduct which lets us know that it happened. So, object, deflection, sign, sparks, interpretant.
お前はもう死んでいる。何?
The thing about the use of index signs in video games is that they allow for players to be able to identify the status of other elements in the UI without looking away from the action. Examples of this are most common in action games. Bayonetta's Trumpeters, Devil May Cry, blah blah blah, you've heard that stuff a million times by now. However, something I think which is interesting with Sekiro is how multiple UI signs share these marriages in the design. That is to say, UI elements share semiotic links. The health bar is red because Sekiro's blood is red. A depletion of red blood or our health bar would result in death. The colour of the Mibu balloons all correspond to their UI element, as well as include a subtle icon of what they represent. The gourds correspond to the status effect, with the exception of the healing gourd, which instead references the prayer beads, which increases the player's vitality. The flame vent is a hard counter to enemies with red eyes. Any number of colours for the eyes of these enemies could have been chosen, but red is in reference to fire. Most red things, like the red gourd, are in reference to this. Sabimaru has a green tinge to its design. The effect of poison is green, as well as the lizards and assassins which can inflict it, Ashina adepts, and the items used to heal and prevent it. While this icon has no relationship to poison, its colour represents it.
And so on and so on.
The Japanese characters which appear when the player is in danger of a perilous attack is actually the kanji word for danger. The text is formatted in a way which evokes the rapid movement of steel as well as the red tinge as a threat to the player's current health. This sign actually forces the player to read the next sign in the form of the enemy's incoming attack. Once the player reads the enemy, they have multiple interpretant options based on these signs. So, object, perilous attack incoming, sign, danger, as well as a recognizable interpretant, Makiri counter, jump on the head or dodge. There's a lot to glean from Sekiro's masterclass in UI design. I just want to finish on a couple of observations for myself and other game designers out there. When looking at this stuff, picking what works best for a sign is where the art of UI design comes in. There's no objective way to make a good UI. Communicating the idea using an icon, symbol, or index is something which will require trial and error. Combining these elements may work out great, or overstate the importance of something, which may cause some players to feel an insult to their intelligence. I'm currently experimenting with a task list for players to do in my photography game. While writing this, I'm thinking of ways I could visually communicate these concepts using semiotics. Perhaps a symbol could be used for a shot type, and an icon for the objects. Clear signs reduce the need for tutorials, as well as the time taken to read that information. It lowers the learning tax that players are expected to go through before they start to sink into a good session of play. I think semiotics has a very natural fit in video game design, as it has opened into a field which allows for theoretical prototyping, but it's not a rigid formula that's going to inhibit the creativity of designers to experiment and find new ways to say, there's poisonous gas in here, if you breathe it in, you'll get sick.
I am the god of hellfire!